on the work of Gilbert Peake, I tried to explain how he'd faced problems when he was building up an account of the performance of children in their schools. His way of working was to say, if you took the average performance of the child and you multiplied it by something that accounted for their family background, plus something that accounted for their early school experiences, and so on, you'd form what we would recognise as the standard regression equation, and that would give us an indication of how they would perform. What you're explaining by developing the regression equation is why the performance of the child differs from the average. And there's several things I want to say about that in general. The first is what Peake says he's trying to explain. What Peake thinks the job of educational research is to explain differences between performance for individuals. Now, I think that's an interesting starting point, but it's not a necessary starting point. If I'm a teacher and I come into a classroom and I give everyone in the class a maths test and everybody scores 57%, Peake says there's nothing to explain. Everybody scored 57%. I say there's something to explain. Who was copying whom? Did somebody get hold of the exam paper and distribute the answers beforehand? There's something still to explain in my terms, but nothing in terms of Peake. So I think we need to take that as a first indication. What you're trying to explain depends on how you see the world. And the second thing that comes into the explanation is Peake recognises that whichever things you put into this equation first claim most of the explanation. So if you put in home background first, home background explains most. If you put in school background claims most. And so you can see a lot of the debates that we've had in educational research over the decades. Is it nature? Is it nurture? This is not a method that allows you to distinguish between the importance of those different impacts, the different influences on school performance. Because what you put in first explains most, and that's an arbitrary decision based on what's in your head when you come in to start the research. There's no escaping this. When you're coming in as a researcher, you have some gut feelings, you have some instincts that tell you how the world works, and they will shape the methods that you use and the results that you get. More generally, I want to say to you, look at the story that I told you about my own engagement with this book. I read it years ago. It created a memory for me. I carried that memory around with me. I thought about it, reflected upon it, developed it. And when I went back to the book, I could not find the exact words that I thought I had read all those years ago. Now think about that, because if I gave you this slim book, Plowden Children 4 years later, and said, you read it and you find out what's in this book, the chances that you would find what I found are very small indeed. So when you refer to a book, when you're using a book as a basis of your research, the important books in your research, you need to explain what you saw in them. You need to explain why they made a difference to the way that you think. You need to explain which bits you're talking about. I'm telling you that I explained to you that I was talking about a footnote at the bottom of page 1. That's where I start. That's what I focused on. You would read the book, you'd take something quite different away. And so even if we've read the same book, you still need to explain to me what you saw in the book, what you read in the book, and what you make out of it. So don't, when you're doing references, simply say Smith 1999 at the end of a sentence, which could mean anything. It could mean nothing, or it could mean anything. Who is this person? Why did they say it? What did they mean by it? What did you understand by it? All of these things need to be explained when you're using a reference. So while I was researching for this video, as I say, I went back to read Pica's book again. I found that he had said what I thought he'd said, but he'd not said it at the length or with the words that I remembered. I'd built it up into something else. But fortunately, I also found a book review written by somebody else about Pica's work. And that book review, I want to go have a look at in some detail now. The way in which this other professor had read Pica's book and what he got out of it. One of the most important and most thorough educational research studies to be carried out in England in recent years was the Plowden National Survey of Parental Attitudes and Circumstances Related to School and Pupil Characteristics, 1964. That's the Plowden Report, or documents related to the Plowden Report. An account of this investigation, like that of several other important British educational products, is tucked away as an appendix in the report of a national commission, in this case the Plowden Report, where it does not get the visibility it deserves. So the author of this book review is drawing your attention to the context, just as I drew your attention to the context of the book written by Pica about the Plowden children 4 years later. However, after the results of the Plowden survey had been examined and found not to be not only highly meaningful but also of considerable practical value, it was not surprising that a follow-up study should be commissioned to be carried out 4 years after the initial inquiry. Yet the importance of this research project does not lie primarily in the nature of the findings. Although they are of considerable interest, since they provide strong support for our ideas on how educational process works, its significance lies more in the methodological issues that are involved. Now, I'm pleased to find that the person who wrote this review has focused, as I do, more on methodological issues than on the actual outcomes, and the manner of interpretation of the evidence that is available, so that, again, it's Pica's interpretation which is the focus of the attention of the review writer here. This investigation is one of the first major studies of the factors contributing to change in relative level of performance during the years of primary and secondary schools, and again emphasising Pica's pioneering nature in developing the analysis. To analyse the data, the author has developed a procedure of stage-wise regression analysis and has, where others have failed, used the procedure to unravel for the first time the complex interrelationships between home and school and initial and final achievement. Now, I think we have some grounds to doubt how effectively that's been done, because it relies upon Pica's assessment, judgment in what order to put the variables in. So I'm not sure that we would agree with the reviewer here that he's successfully untangled them, but he's made clear his efforts to untangle them. The main contribution of this report to educational research is that the author has broken new ground in the employment of methods in analysing data. Furthermore, he has succeeded in presenting the results of a complex inquiry employing complex procedures for analysing data with remarkable conciseness and clarity. No research worker engaged in survey research in education or in allied fields should fail to read this work. But again, why am I making such a fuss about the work of Gilbert Pica? Well, here's another reviewer who's telling you if you're involved in any way with research, survey studies in research, and I think that also means if you read survey studies in educational research, you need to have read this book or at least be aware of what it says. The report has not, however, been written for the methodologist, but for the educational administrator and policymaker, and now he's going to look at some of those results, particularly the idea that what happens earlier can affect what happens later, but that what happens later cannot affect what happens earlier. And in that respect, we can see some of the influence of the results in what happens in education later when governments, when the World Bank, when international organisations emphasise the importance of investing in early childhood education rather than in university education. The rates of return, the effect and impact of those early years education was thought to be much, much higher than the returns and the impact of higher education, in great measure because of the studies that were conducted by people like Pica in the 1960s, 1970s, that showed that what happened earlier could have a bigger impact than the things that happened later. The reviewer who's writing this review is adding some caveats. He's saying, well, you ought to be a little bit cautious about those conclusions about early childhood education, because this is not in fact a study of early childhood education. It's a study of children in their primary schools. And although Pica does refer to the old adage that if you have a child for the first 5 years of their life, then you have them for life, that's not actually demonstrated in the data that he's analysing. So some caution about some of the conclusions that were drawn, but again, let me say, and I agree entirely with the reviewer here, the reviewer is emphasising that this is a methodological book. It's not the results that are so important as much as the methodology that has been tested, presented, and which is very widely adopted subsequently. And the name of the reviewer, here we are, J.P. Keeves, another name to conjure with. Who is John Keeves? Keeves was professor in an Australian university, very prominent in the 1970s in the development of early studies, international statistical studies of how children performed in schools and comparisons of different countries. The earliest study was a study of 27 countries' performance in science education, and that led on into the work of the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement. Or the IEA. Don't ask me how the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement becomes the IEA, but it does, and their work continues to this day. The first international maths and science study, FIMS, followed by the second international study, second international maths and science study, SIMS, followed by what it became afterwards was TIMS, Trends in Mathematics and Science Studies. And that was followed by PEARLS. No idea what PEARLS stands for, but it's got something to do with reading literacy. And the TIMS studies and the PEARLS studies are conducted periodically, and they grew out of the work that Keeves and Pica did together. You do a Google search, you'll find them without any trouble at all. Very informative. What's of interest primarily, though, to me at the moment is that there was a huge sensitivity then in the 1970s not to put countries that were wealthy and had well-established educational systems on the same page as countries that were struggling with resources, were struggling with coming out of colonialism. There was a sensitivity not to try and apply exactly the same standards to all countries. The studies collected more and more contextual information, became more and more nuanced in how they described what was happening in schools, and they were moving towards an obvious solution, an obvious conclusion that you were more likely to learn something in school if you were taught it. I mean, that seems to be fairly obvious, but it was looking as though the context was explaining something about what was happening in schools. As soon as the IEA studies became really serious educational research and nuanced in that regard, nobody wanted them anymore, or they were not seen as being world leading, and they were replaced by studies like OECD's PISA studies. And OECD's PISA studies, conducted periodically every 4 years to 3 years, however frequently they are conducted. But notice that the sensitivity is gone now. All countries subject to the same methodology, all countries put on the same tables, all countries, no sensitivity as to the difference between countries being in different stages of development. All of that has gone, and some of the transparency over the methods that are being used. Remember how transparent in his methodology Pika was. Remember how Keyves praised him for that transparency and clarity. Although Keyves himself was influential in the setting up of PISA, and PISA inherits directly from what was learnt from the Tim studies and the Pearl studies, in actual fact, much of the public spiritedness, the openness of data and the openness of method has disappeared in PISA. The OECD is more interested in emphasising the results of PISA than explaining the nuance of the methods that are being employed. So Pika's work leads directly to some of the most important statistical work in comparative education of the IEA and of OECD and PISA, and the lineage is quite clear. If Pika had not been a pioneer in this field, it's unlikely that we would have the obsession in the field with statistical methods and large-scale surveys that we seem to have at the moment. I'm not saying that's entirely good, but I am saying that when it was born, Pika and after Pika, Keyves were very keen in trying to make sure that the methods were open and that they were visible to everybody.